Greetings everyone. Welcome to the special lecture on elimination of violence against women. Under the global theme, Orange the World, End Violence Against Women Now, the United Nations is marking the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence from 25th November to 10th December. Women's activists have marked 25th November as a day against violence since 1981. It was on this day in 1960 that the three Mirabal sisters, who were political activists in the Dominican Republic, were brutally assassinated on the orders of the then Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. Now, having discussed the genesis of the day and the importance behind the day, let us come to the Indian scenario and let us kind of understand that what are the ground realities for India. Over 30% women suffered physical and sexual violence by their spouses in 5 out of 22 surveyed states and union territories in the country, according to the National Family Health Survey 5, with activists and NGOs fearing its further rise during the course of COVID-19 pandemic. So, NFHS surveys have thrown very valuable light and insight on several aspects related to family life in India. NFHS 5 has provided data on gender-based violence. There is data about domestic violence which is captured in these surveys, and registered crimes of domestic violence are reported in the annual report of the National Crime Records Bureau. The Health Ministry recently released the key findings of the first phase of NFHS 5 conducted in 2019-20. This is the 5th edition of the survey, covering 6.1 lakh sample households. 17 states and 5 union territories have been covered in the first phase of the survey. The second phase of the survey, covering the remaining 12 states and 2 union territories, was paused because of COVID-19 and was resumed in November 2020. The sample size for the survey varies from state to state because of the differences in population as well as age composition. The latest NFHS survey has a separate section on gender-based violence, under which data on women aged between 18 to 49 years and who have experienced spousal violence and physical violence during pregnancy has been provided. There is also data on young women who experienced sexual violence. Both physical and sexual violence have been included in spousal violence. The key findings as per NFHS surveys are that more than 40% ever married women in Karnataka and Bihar have faced spousal violence. The findings from the survey indicate that there has been a decrease in the proportion of women who reported experience of spousal violence in most parts of the country compared to NFHS 4, which was carried out in 2015 to 2016. Of the 22 states and union territories covered in the first phase of NFHS 5, it is observed that except in Karnataka, Assam, Maharashtra, Ladakh, Sikkim and Himachal Pradesh, the proportion of women who ever experienced spousal violence has decreased compared to the previous editions of the NFHS. Another remarkable finding was that greater proportion of rural women experienced spousal violence than their urban counterparts. The reason could be illiteracy, which is still rampant in the countryside. Also, there is the problem of under-reporting. NFHS 5 data clearly establishes under-reporting of crime against women in several states like in Bihar and so many other states also. NFHS 5 has provided detailed data not only on gender-based violence but also on the problem of under-reporting. Of the 22 states and union territories covered in the first phase of NFHS 5, it is observed that except in states like Karnataka, Assam, Maharashtra and some other states, the proportion of women who ever experienced spousal violence has decreased, but then the decrease has not been tremendous, but at least the trend of decreasing violence in some states has been reported, which is definitely a welcome change. Another disturbing fact that has emerged is violence during pregnancy. So, proportion of women who faced physical violence when pregnant is highest in Karnataka. Physical violence during pregnancy can be harmful both for the mother as well as the unborn baby. This could even result in the death and also preterm delivery. About 5.8% of the women in Karnataka in the defined age group stated that they faced physical violence while pregnant, and this proportion has been the highest among states. A total of 4% of pregnant women in Telangana, around 3.8% in Andhra Pradesh, 3.5% in West Bengal and 3.3% in Maharashtra reported having experienced physical violence. Mizoram, Himachal Pradesh, Kerala and Nagaland reported violence against pregnant women below 1%. Sikkim and Meghalaya were among the states where this percentage increased compared to the previous survey. As is the case with spousal violence, the proportion of rural women who experienced physical violence while pregnant was higher in rural areas. So, therefore, there is rampant problem which is existing in the countryside, and something definitely needs to be done urgently. There has been an improvement in the states of Bihar, Tripura, Telangana, Manipur, Andhra Pradesh and Kerala, while the proportion of young women who experienced sexual violence before they turned 18 increased in several states like Maharashtra, Assam, Goa and West Bengal. As per the statistics, about 11% of women aged between 18 to 29 years in Karnataka faced sexual violence before they turned 18. Karnataka is followed by West Bengal, where 9.7% of young women reported facing sexual violence. At the same time, this number was less than 2% in several states like Nagaland. The proportion of young rural women who faced sexual violence before they turned 18 is more in rural areas than the urban counterparts, except in states like Kerala, Nagaland, Meghalaya, Sikkim and Andhra Pradesh. So, the fact that emerges out of all these statistical details is that home is one of the most dangerous places for females. Research by the United Nations shows that home is the most dangerous place for women and children worldwide, and the problem is not only limited to India. April 2020, Executive Director of UN Women labelled violence against women as the shadow pandemic. UN Population Fund predicted million cases of domestic violence to occur worldwide. and they did occur. Now, what were the causes of rising violence during lockdown, which has been reported worldwide? One was, of course, a reduced ability to seek help. Then it was difficult to make and maintain contact with women because of the nature of lockdown and inability of women to come out of their homes and to report abuse. Then there was also a decline in referral follow-up. There it was very difficult to assess risk as well as to determine protective factors from remote areas. So, also easy availability of labor of women all day long took a toll on several women and their health. There are several factors that are responsible for perpetuating gender-based violence. Let us discuss them one by one. Firstly, let us talk about the cultural factors. So, the gender-specific socialization is a very important factor. Cultural definitions of appropriate sex roles, expectation of roles both of men and women. Then the customs of marriage, acceptability of violence as a means to resolve conflict, and the idea that if a woman remains quiet and does not react, then somehow the family would live in peace thereafter. So, this is the kind of mindset that kind of makes violence culturally acceptable. The next factor that we can talk about is the economic factor. So, women's economic dependence on men, limited access to financial resources, discriminatory laws regarding access to property, inheritance and maintenance after divorce or widowhood, then limited access to employment in formal and informal sector because of limited access to education and training for women. So, because more and more women are kept out of professional studies due to financial constraints of parents, as the parents prefer spending more on the education of the boys. So, as a result, the daughters are not really able to get the best kind of education or qualification, and hence their job prospects are also fairly compromised. As a result, they continue to remain dependent on their spouses for a longer period of their life. Then other factor that one can talk about is the legal factor. So, lack of gender sensitive laws, lesser legal status of women either by written law or practice. So, laws regarding divorce, child custody, inheritance, legal definition of rape and domestic abuse, low levels of legal literacy among women, then gender sensitive treatment, gender insensitive treatment of women and girls by police and judiciary, and the long drawn out judicial process. All these factors combine and make legal hurdles quite challenging for women. Then we can also talk about the political factors. Here one can mention underrepresentation of women in decision making bodies. So, whether it is politics or it is private sector or media, it is men who are dominating these spheres. So, there is limited organization of women as a political force and limited participation of women in political systems. So, because there are very few women who are lawmakers and who are decision makers, so therefore, law is invariably acting not in their favor. Now, what needs to be done in order to deal with this situation? We all know that there are problems and countries world over, the governments world over, international agencies, everyone and all the organizations have been talking about the problem. but one must also look at the suggestions. What can be done to deal with this situation, which is a historically created problem and which has further been, the problem has further been exacerbated in the present times. Now, there is a need to support individual women to understand their rights and take up leadership positions. So, there is a need to strengthen technical and other professional skills of women, not only as professionals but also as leaders. So, organizations need to take this stand and take some practical initiatives to bring about this positive change. Then there is also a need to support women's collective action. So, there should be more alliances, networks which promote a women's rights agenda across sectors, including humanitarian and support for safer and more effective influencing. Then another very important factor is empowerment. What do you mean by empowerment? It can be described as a process of gaining control over the self, control over ideology, thinking process, the resources that lead to powerful positions, and women's empowerment is the process through which women individually as well as collectively, they become aware of not only their rights but also of the power structures, and they start operating these power structures to bring about a change, a positive change in their lives, and also they start challenging the gender inequalities that have been persisting since several centuries. Then another very important factor is to bridge the policy practice gap. By closing the policy practice gap, for example, legal and policy reform to support women's leadership, implementation of reforms, redressal of grievances, then also to create an enabling environment. For example, challenging social norms and expectations, then also facilitating women's leadership. All this can create safe places for women to work, to organize and to influence. And of course, there is a need to reduce poverty, to reduce illiteracy, and there is a need to increase investment for women's rights at work. So, if all these changes can be done, then definitely the situation can begin to change. However, unless and until men and boys are also engaged in this process, nothing much can be achieved. Men and boys can be important allies and change agents in transforming damaging social norms, beliefs, behaviors, and helping to minimize backlash from men when patriarchy is challenged. Because when patriarchy is challenged, it is the position, it is the authority of men and boys that would be compromised. So, they have to be taken into confidence, they have to be groomed by the mothers in such a way, and they have to be convinced of the fact that only if women folk feel safe and secure and they have equal rights can they progress. So, basically there is a need to focus on specific goals to attain the required goals. So, there is a need to reduce risk of gender-based violence by implementing prevention and mitigation strategies across all areas of humanitarian response. So, there is a need to promote resilience by strengthening national and community-based systems that prevent and mitigate gender-based violence, and by enabling survivors and those at risk of gender-based violence to access care and support, because only then women will have confidence to come out of their homes and to report about the abuse. Then to aid recovery of communities and societies by supporting local and national capacity. This also is a very important step. And then there are also some other agreed conclusions that have been agreed upon by CSW 57. This agreement is one step more for realizing the rights and dignity of women and girls. So, by adopting this document, governments have made clear that discrimination and violence against women and girls has no place in the 21st century. And the document calls for increased attention and accelerated action for prevention as well as response. The important focus is on prevention, including through education, awareness, fundraising, and addressing gender inequalities in the political, economic and social spheres. There is definitely a need to look at the laws that protect women and their rights. The laws have always been there in India. For example, the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006, Special Marriage Act 1954, Dowry Prohibition Act 1961, then Indian Divorce Act 1969, Indecent Representation of Women Act, Maternity Benefit Act 1861, Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971, and the list goes on. But now it needs to be seen that what can be done to implement these laws in the true spirit, and unless and until that is attempted, the situation is not really going to change. So, there is a need to take remedial measures, use social media, be media literate and critical. The females must interrupt sexist, homophobic and transphobic language, and they must interrupt abuse, stop street harassment, come up with an action plan and recognize the role of gender in violence. Also, there is a need to stop victim blaming, stop stereotyping men and women's roles. Also, there is a need to be supportive, be aware of resources for girls and women, and there is a need to talk to others about ending violence and be a mentor. Also, there is a need to understand the concept of consent. And there are a number of reasons to stop violence, because violence against women and girls is a human rights issue. It is not only a gender issue. World can't afford cost of violence, and full participation of women and girls is worthwhile economically, politically, culturally, and there can be no looking back. Thank you.